to go into the nuts and bolts a bit of not just that project, but in your lab in general. And maybe there isn't a good answer to this, like because you're probably less monolithic in terms of the software tools that you use, or research methodologies, or data science approaches that you use relative to, say, a company in a lab like yours. But do you think there are some generalizations that you could give to our listeners around the kinds of tools that you use? So, like, what programming languages do you use in your lab? Are there particular approaches that get used more often? Just to kind of give us a coloring of when somebody's doing the kind of exciting research that you're doing in a university lab, what kinds of libraries, what kind of software are they using?
We are a very Python heavy lab. I actually became a Python developer. I didn't write a piece of Python code until after my PhD. That project that I was referring to with my wife, Jessica, that we published, she's a Python developer. Most recently worked at Amazon, and I was a MATLAB programmer during my PhD because that's kind of what you did in the sciences back in the 2000s. And she challenged me to do a code off on that project. Like when I was sort of complaining when we, I've told the story a couple of times, but like we were watching reruns of Star Trek Deep Space Nine one night, as like super nerdy programming couples do apparently. And I was like, hey, I think I figured out an algorithm for this like brain sort of NLP thing. And she asked me what it was, and we sort of like whiteboarded it out a little bit. And she's like, I could totally code that faster than you in Python. And so I started writing it in MATLAB. She started doing it in Python. She finished that night and had it working and like had the prototype built. And I was like, okay, that was pretty impressive. And so then I became a Python developer. And so we're primarily operating Python. And my lab's GitHub repo is just like github.com/Voytek research, all one word, no underscores or anything. And you can see we've got, I don't know, at this point, dozens, if not hundreds of repositories where every research paper that we publish, we try and have a open repository associated with it, where we'll write Python packages. So my lab has developed 3 open source Python packages. FOOF, which stands for Fitting Oscillations in 1 over F, which is being renamed to SpecParam, is a Python package that was to parameterize neural power spectra. That has since been adapted by fusion research labs and astrophysics groups to parameterize the spectral data that they're getting off of those different sources. So we're renaming the package to make it more generalizable because this is like an open source dream, right? We wrote code to analyze neural data, and now it's being adopted by scientists all over the world for other things where it also just the math works. So we're very proud because the code just works, which is great. So that SpecParam package, and then Bicycle, which is the cycle by cycle analysis of neural oscillations, which also is apparently being used in industry for other rhythmic time series analysis. And then NeuroDSP, which is neural digital signal processing. So the vast majority of what my lab does is Python-based work around time series analysis. How do we discover patterns in data? But it's like laughably simple. And I would say even simplistic what the lab does. So instead of relying on like, transformers and, AI and deep learning to discover patterns in time series, we say, okay, we know what some of the generators, the physiological generators of these signals that we're recording are. So instead of trying to discover patterns using deep learning, let's try and like bootstrap up our knowledge of physiology and try and just like stick as close to the raw data as possible. And so for like the action potentials, right, we parameterize each action potential using a very simple number of parameters, right? So we find each action potential, and we then populate a pandas data frame in Python, where each row is an action potential, and each column is one of the features that we've parameterized. So we say, okay, at what time point did the action potential initiate? In the 5 milliseconds leading up to, or 2 milliseconds or whatever it is leading up to the initiation of that action potential, what was the voltage ramp slope? How long did it take to go from the initiation point to the peak of the action potential? And what was the voltage change? At the peak of the action potential, how spiky was that peak, or how smooth was it? And then after that peak, what was the decay rate of an exponential decay function back to the lowest point of the hyperpolarization of that voltage, right? And so it's like very simplistic. The joke in the lab is that the entire lab is practically built on scipy.optimize.curvefit, which is just one function in the scipy Python package that allows you to fit and parameterize curves, right? And so most of what we do is basically built off of that, where we say, let's take our rich physiological data and let's give respect to the variability that we're seeing, rather than trying to average the variability away. We're at a point in science where we can leverage that variability and use that variability to discover any patterns. And so rather than assuming that signals are binary, like the action potentials, let's look at the subtle variability from spike to spike and see if that is systematically related to any kind of features of the inputs, right? And what's amazing is that this very simplistic approach is actually incredibly useful across different domains. So we have a project going on right now here at UC San Diego with Dr. Ulrike Bergesdatter-Green, who is the head of implantable cardiac devices. And so we've taken the same code for breaking each action potential waveform into these components, but applied that to the heart electrocardiogram, the ECG signal, which has 5 known parameter peaks, features, the P, Q, R, S, and T complexes. We know physiologically what each one of these bumps in the heart signal means. It has to do exactly with the different chambers of the heart opening and closing, contracting and relaxing. And we've adapted the code for action potentials, and we now are using it for heart data to try and see if we could use that to discover any kind of like cardiac events in the time series. And so we use Python to discover features in physiological time series using very simplistic and simple, I should say, but I don't know, maybe simplistic, interpretable features that stick as close to the biology and as to the data as possible.